Hi, I'm happy to welcome everyone on this short YouTube video about the EB-5 visa and our update for 2025-26. In this short video, we're going to cover the data released by USCIS for the fiscal 2025 to see what are the trends which were in place in 2025, and we'll try to predict how these trends will affect 2026. Today, I'm hosting this video with Ahmed Khan, who is the Vice President of the Regional Center EB-5 IN. Ahmed, thank you again for joining me on this recording.
Thank you, Varvara, for having me. Always a pleasure to chat EB-5 with you.
Great. So, Ahmed, I think to start, I would appreciate a super quick summary on what's the EB-5 program is for the people who is not familiar with the program.
Sure, absolutely. And just to give some context about who I am, I'm the Senior Vice President at EB-5AN. We are one of the many regional center options that investors in the EB-5 program have. And my background is that I'm an immigration attorney. I've been practicing now for somewhere around 13 years. Time flies, and so I've got a lot of experience with EB-5 in general. To answer your question about what EB-5 is, for those who are kind of looking into it for the first time or just finding out what it is about, it is an immigration by investment program that's sponsored by the U.S. government, basically through an $800,000 or $1,050,000 investment. Investors can basically get the opportunity to obtain a U.S. permanent green card. There's a lot of other factors that come into play, but one of the main drivers of this program is what the government calls regional centers. And so investors have two options. One is to find a business themselves, take on the headache of creating multiple jobs. 10 jobs are required for every investor in this program, managing their investment, meeting all the immigration criteria, and meeting all the financial benefits that you would want from a business. Or they could basically hand off all of that to a regional center. The regional centers will go out, find projects that qualify for the program, collect investors, and bring their funds into those projects and basically help them to meet all the immigration criteria while managing the investment. So it's a great opportunity to basically obtain a green card relatively quickly, as long as you've got the money. And yeah, we're kind of always, it's a very interesting program because it changes every few years. We are at the tail end of what is called the Reform and Integrity Act era, the RIA era. And so lots of questions because things are going to change again, probably next year. And now we've got 3 to 4 years of data under the current kind of program. So we can use that to look at trends and how people have responded.
Great. So now let's look at the numbers. So the first slide covers the EB-5 petitions, I-5 to 6E petitions filed with the regional center projects. We can see the strong growth over the last 3 years. As Ahmed already mentioned, in 2022, the program had the restart with Reform and Integrity Act. And after that, we see that each year the number of filed petitions is increasing. Ahmed, what do you think are the drivers of the increase in 2025?
Yeah, I think that, what we've really seen is a bringing forward of demand. And so you can see that obviously the amount of applications received by USCIS has increased year over year. 2023 was really, to me, kind of a guinea pig, as we call it, year, where a lot of investors who were finding out about the Reform and Integrity Act were jumping in and saying, okay, what is this program? Let me try it. They filed their applications, and luckily USCIS has fixed up a lot of things. One of the key things is processing times. And so in early to mid 2024, a lot of the folks that had filed, just a year prior started to see their applications approved, started to see people receive their green cards. And that news travels fast, especially in the United States immigration world, where green cards are hard to come by. People receiving green cards, sometimes in as little as 9 to 12 months, was a big driver to push demand forward. And so in 2024, you saw more and more people continue to look at this program as a viable option. They filed more applications. And then sure enough, they were also starting to receive approvals. And in 2025, we really saw the program just take off. More and more projects in the market. So part of the issue, in 23 was there weren't that many projects available for investors to invest into. as regional centers caught up and got their documents filed, got their projects approved, brought those projects to market, the investors had an opportunity to look at those deals and ultimately make their investments into them. And then, like I said, there's been so many success stories from every regional center, really, that you hear in the market, and that's great. What it means is that the program is working, and I think when you're investing $800,000 or more into anything, what you want is the confidence that your money is not going to waste. You're getting the result that you're seeking. And so seeing other folks receive their green cards in a timely manner, based on their expectations, I think it really just helped push demand forward and help people to get comfortable with the program.
Do you think the noise around the gold card was a kind of one of the reasons the program became more known? Let's put it in this way.
Yeah, absolutely. I think that, and thanks for bringing that up. One of the big spikes that we saw was back in March of 25, when basically President first mentioned his idea of this gold card, a card that, he would sponsor and would ultimately lead to faster approvals based on what he said. And everyone would get a green card as long as they had $1 million or $5 million to invest. And people really panicked because one of the things that he said in his initial announcement was that it was going to replace the EB-5 program. Now, since then, we've learned a lot more about where the nexus for this idea came from, and that it basically came from nowhere. And that a lot of what he had, quote unquote, promised was not just even possible, much less likely to happen. EB-5 can't be replaced unless Congress basically rewrites the laws. Congress certainly has the power to do that, but EB-5 historically is one of the programs that receives bipartisan support from both sides of the aisle. If you think about it just logically, it's a program that brings billions of dollars into the United States. It brings the types of immigrants that I think everyone can kind of get behind, extremely successful individuals who are accomplished and have money to invest into the US economy and help create jobs for US workers. So tough to see this program going away, no matter what President might have said in the past. And certainly as the year has gone on, we've seen that the gold card really didn't materialize the way that people expected. And I think we've seen a little bit more calm around that worry. Now the new worry is, reauthorization, which we'll get to, I think, a little bit later. But certainly we saw a big spike, especially in the first quarter of 2025, the second fiscal quarter of 2025.
The second set of data is the petitions filed by direct EB-5 investors. So that's the investors who choose the option to invest in their own business. And this proportion is more or less stays the same. It's just around 5% from the total number of applicants, but surprisingly to see it's actually going up as well.
It is. And I think this was the most surprising statistic is that every year we're seeing more and more investors at least try to file a direct application. And, the denial rates are incredibly high. You can see on the screen here, 58%, almost 2/3 of these applications are ultimately denied by the US government. And yet that isn't turning people away. I think there's a few different indicators. One is that it's a lot of money to invest into an EB-5 application. And I think that when you're investing almost $800,000 or sometimes even up to $1 million with fees, a lot of investors are like, I would like to have control over that money. So even if it means taking a little bit more of a risk on the immigration side, I feel more comfortable investing my own money in something that I control. But I think any good immigration attorney will tell you that you're really mortgaging your immigration process for maybe some financial benefit. And a lot of times what we've seen over the years is that you end up losing both. Sometimes you lose the money and you lose the green card opportunity. It's somewhat surprising, like I said, to see these kinds of numbers. But I do think that what another trend that we've kind of seen, even on the regional center side, especially with the government really incentivizing filings in high unemployment and rural areas, is more bespoke opportunities, as I would call them, right? So gone are the days where you see a $500 million kind of mega raise in EB-5. You're much more likely to see an $80 million or smaller EB-5 raise, sometimes even as small as $10 to $15 million as a more tailored kind of opportunity for investors. And the closer we get down to, 1 million, the more a direct investment starts to make a lot of sense as well to, in some investors' minds, the ones who are more entrepreneurial and feel like there's more opportunity there for them. So I'm never going to say that it's a great idea to do a direct investment. History and experience has taught me that typically a regional center investment is a much safer and much more predictable route to take. But certainly there are people who have, done a very successful EB-5 application through a direct investment. And you just have to have a really good immigration attorney that knows what they're doing and is creative enough, I think, to put it all together. And then obviously there's a lot of responsibility on the investor as well to make sure they're doing everything correctly.
What do you think are the main reasons for denial? I mean, denial rate is crazy high. So what would be your guess?
Yeah, I've got a few theories. One is probably not what investors want to hear, but a lot of investors who are gearing towards a direct investment, they typically have kind of an outsized confidence in their ability to make the deal successful. Most of I think, very experienced firms that do EB-5 typically will try to tell you, don't do a direct unless you absolutely already have a business that's set up, that's already generating revenue, already has job creation that you've already invested millions into. Starting from scratch is just it's a tall mountain to climb in the EB-5 context.
Yeah.
Well, I think a lot of those investors that still say, no, I want to do it anyways, they go out and they find maybe an attorney that tells them what they want to hear. And often what you want to hear is not what you should be hearing when in the legal context, whether it's immigration or otherwise. And so you might have inexperienced attorneys who are more willing to file these applications. The other thing is that it's tricky. I think a lot of investors think that, oh, I'm just investing money here, I'm creating 10 jobs. So they make really simple mistakes. Easy example of this might be that they go buy a business and that already has 10 or more employees. And they say, look, I bought a business. I paid, $1.3 million for this business. There's 10 employees. I deserve a green card. And the way that USCIS looks at job creation is that you can't have those jobs already there. You can't buy an existing business. You can, sure, but then you have to invest more money into it and you have to create 10 new jobs that didn't exist beforehand. Simple mistakes like that an experienced immigration attorney can kind of snuff out right at the beginning, sometimes just gets overlooked because they're looking for the cheapest or the fastest filing attorney versus actually getting good advice.
Okay, thanks. And now we're getting to the split between petitions filed with rural projects and high unemployment projects. Both these types of projects, they are TEA projects, targeted employment area. And both these options have the investment amount of $800,000 US. But rural projects in general have faster processing times, while urban considered to be less risky. The other projects, which actually include their standard EB-5 petitions with investment amount of $1,050,000, and the forms where it's not clear if it's urban or rural project are only 3% of the total filings, so the number is really low. Ahmed, what will you say on the rural high unemployment projects? Is this split something you kind of expected to see in the numbers, or it's a surprise for you as well?
No, it totally makes sense. I think that, what we have seen over the last year and a half really is even countries that are not worried about that. So the first couple of years of the Reform and Integrity Act, India, China, two countries that are historically backlogged and there's limited visa numbers, but a lot of applicants, they really ran towards the rural set aside to some degree because there was more of those visas allocated. And so they wanted to basically make sure that if there was a backlog, they could get through that backlog faster because there's more visas available in that category. The rest of the world actually started running towards rural in the last year and a half for a different reason. They saw that people were getting approved in just 6 or 7 months with rural applications. And they said, well, we want a fast result too. And a lot of the HUA or urban kind of results that we were seeing were more than 2 times the timeline. So whereas we were seeing a lot of rural applications being approved in just 6 to 9 months, where we're sitting at close to 700 plus approvals, and 80% of them happened in under 9 months, which is a pretty crazy statistic to me. They were saying, well, HUAs are taking, sometimes 20 to 24 months to get the initial 526E approval. I'm willing to wait a little bit longer to get my money back. I'm willing to kind of take a little bit more risk on the financial side with a trusted regional center if it means I can get my green card almost a year and a half faster, or sometimes even 2 years faster. And so we see this big kind of rush into rural over the last year and a half. And so we did expect that the numbers would look something like this. Honestly, if you hear the marketing out there and you listen to some of the regional centers that only sell one deal or the other, you would think that, rural is going to be 90% of the filings. So to me, less than 60% still, to me, it's like, wow, I thought it was going to be a little bit more. Um, I think what's interesting is what you said about, the perception that high unemployment or urban projects can be safer versus rural. I completely disagree. I think that a project is safe or risky regardless of its location. If you look at, past deals in EB-5, some of the biggest failures were in really big urban areas. It's not like they were protected just because they were in New York City or Los Angeles or Miami. What ultimately protects investors is the way that the deal is structured and what is actually put into the contracts to protect those investors versus other lenders or other pieces of the same financing puzzle. So to me, I think as more education comes out, people have also become more familiar with these rural deals. They've learned to understand them and they've learned to assess them a lot more with a lot more scrutiny and feel comfortable investing into them. So yeah, I think that there's a lot of generalizations out there. And when you invest this much money into anything, I don't think any generalization is always true. You have to be able to look at each deal individually and think about the specifics.
I'm 100% agree in regards of specifics, and each deal is different. But in commercial real estate, location, 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 it's very
100%.
hard to
100%.
prove that the project somewhere in nowhere can be more appealing with the same kind of structure as something similar in the city or near the big city. So from my
Yeah.
perspective, still location matters a lot, but of course it very much depends on the deal itself. The next slide is covering the percentage of the investors in each category by nationality. And when I was looking at this number, it was interesting for me to see that actually, despite the fact that many non-Indian and Chinese investors do look at the rural projects, at the end of 2000, during the 2025, still the only nationalities which preferred the rural over high unemployment projects are Indian and Chinese. The rest nationalities, including the rest of the world, they still tend to prefer high unemployment projects lightly, but still are a bit more on the numbers. And again, it's not surprising to see that China is dominant
Dominating.
in both
Yeah.
these categories. So what are your thoughts on these numbers?
Yeah, I think that a lot of these numbers make a lot of sense to me. I do agree with you that, you clearly see that Vietnam, Taiwan, and South Korea are dominated by HUA projects. Some of that is cultural. I've traveled to South Korea multiple times. We do have a strong presence there, and a lot of those investors are just more comfortable with urban area projects. And, who are we to argue? One of our regional centers kind of points of pride is that we like to have multiple projects in each of the different categories so that investors can choose the one that they feel the most comfortable with. I agree with you. I think it's kind of interesting to see the rest of world split. I know the percentages here are, you can see there's almost like a 6% difference, but the numbers themselves are pretty close. You've got just somewhere in the mid 300s in rest of world filings in both rural and HUA. I would warrant that if we broke that down by country, we'd see some interesting trends
Probably.
as well. But I think it's telling, right? I think there's that 50-50 split tells you that, the rest of the world isn't convinced that HUA or rural is better, but they're more informed or they're making their decision based on their priorities. And, an easy example here is a lot of the HUA deals that we see on the market, and certainly the ones that we try to bring to market, we try to make them more financially compelling because we feel that, you're giving something up on the immigration side to make it worth it. You should probably be getting something on the financial side. Sometimes that might just be safety. Other times it could be a shorter duration project that allows investors to get their money back a little bit sooner. Sometimes it's just a bigger developer. And so a little bit more comfort level with the sponsor for the deal itself. It's no shock that China and India continue to dominate. But certainly I think we saw also last year that India kind of crept up a little bit closer to China, whereas in the years past, China was just like completely dominant. India was, a very small fraction. And now we're seeing India take up almost a third of all filings on the rural side. So very interesting, but I wouldn't say it's altogether surprising, but the minutia in this is always interesting to kind of try to figure out what the trends are.
I think it's the first year when actually rural projects dominated the market, right?
Correct.
Yeah,
Yeah. So definitely the first year that we saw rural dominate, definitely dominate, but even I think be more so in 23, it was almost a 2-to-1 HUA
sure.
over rural, 22 and 23. And then 24, we kind of saw almost like a 60-40 split again towards HUA. And then 25, very clearly people have started preferring rural. Especially from China. I think the biggest change was from China. You could look at years past and see that a lot of the Chinese applicants were going towards HUA still. And last year it shifted.
It's really interesting what's going to happen when the backlog would hit Chinese market on rural category first, and that's going to happen in rural category first, right? Because the number of approved petition there more than in high unemployment, so backlog definitely going to hit the rural projects first for Chinese and Indian investors. So it's interesting how things would move forward then.
Absolutely. I mean, I think there's so many different variables that come into play here, but
Yeah,
that's very true, right? I mean, backlogs happen first at a country level and then at the set aside level, right? So you become backlogged first as a country, and then ultimately the set asides are extra visas that are available to everybody based on where they filed in their application. And once those run out, then everyone is basically backlogged in those set aside categories in the sense that there's no more of those extra visas available. I agree. It's going to be very interesting to see. The way I look at it is if an investor today had a 2-year backlog, let's just say in India, for example, and in a rural project, they might still get their green card before we see some HUA investors from India even get a 526E approval if they filed on the same date. So the time of the backlog matters. I certainly agree that rural will backlog first. There's just so many people who have received their approvals,
yeah.
but that's going to continue. And what's not being added to that queue of people asking for a green card are people in the HUA and infrastructure sides because they're just not seeing approvals at even like half the rate. They're seeing it at like a tenth of the rate. So it's going to be a very interesting few years as we kind of start clearing through these numbers.
I actually think like for some investors, it may be an interesting option to go for high unemployment projects and file mandamus to get in front of the lot
Yeah,
and try
but
this
over
option.
that was the big thing, and especially I think investors who are based in the U.S. They were really pushing hard to just file in the HOA category and then file a mandamus. And sure enough, USCIS started pushing back. Everything gets abused until the government figures it out and then pushes back, right? We saw that with loans being provided by regional centers themselves. Now we're seeing it with mandamuses where USCIS just won a case in one of the district courts saying that a year was not an undue burden in terms of timeline for them to adjudicate applications. Is that controlling over every, EB-5 application? No, but it sets a precedent. Then we saw them come out with that guidance on the FAQs saying that, this is how we're going to order applications. We're going to first look at 956F approved petitions in the rural side, and so on, and then chronologically. So they've given themselves some ammo on which to push back against mandamuses. And although they can't really, by law, they can't vindictively deny a mandamus application or deny an application because you filed a mandamus, like people say, oh, you shouldn't poke the bear. I don't really think that that's necessarily part of it. They're not going to get annoyed with you and then deny you. They're still bound by the rules of law. But when you file a mandamus, now you're bringing an attorney into the mix on the government side. And that attorney could review your application and say, hey, there's something interesting here that I want to dig deeper into that maybe a normal adjudicator may not have gone all the way into to see. And now you're looking for that extra kind of information, and that can lead to source of funds issues and things like that. So let's see. I think there's so many different interesting, what's it called, strategies out there. But I think if you're Indian and Chinese, you obviously have to do whatever you can at this point to try to play the game of retrogression and avoid it. But if you're from the rest of the world, it almost doesn't really matter. And I would agree that HUA then starts to look very, very preferential because a lot of those projects aren't familiar areas with really great sponsors, sometimes very short turnaround times now with the new sustainment rules. A lot to like about those deals as well.
Okay, the next slide is covering the number of new petition filed for regional center designation license, we can say.
Yeah.
And the second half is the petitions filed for approval of the new EB-5 projects.
Mhm.
It's surprisingly to see that number of regional center registration more than 3 times less in 2025 than in 2024. What do you think the main reason for that?
Well, I think that part of it is that a lot of the bigger regional centers realize that, okay, we need to probably just have multiple regional centers that cover, all the US if we can. And so, I think we were pioneers in that respect. We've had multiple regional centers for many years now. That's kind of how EB-5AN, which stands for Affiliate Network, got started. But what you see, I think, from 23 to 24 is that a lot of the big regional centers have established themselves across multiple geographies and are no longer interested then, especially in 2025, knowing that we've got grandfathering coming up, knowing that we've got reauthorization coming up. Now it just seems like you're throwing money away to get a regional center that, there may be a whole new process for getting a regional center designated after 2027. So I think most of the big guys have already got their regional centers in place. I think most of the smaller folks are kind of saying, okay, let's just wait and see what happens.
Going against renting options.
Exactly. And so, renting regional centers has become extremely popular. It's always been popular, but I think even some of the big names are renting regional centers from other big names, right? So the 956 is kind of, it takes a long time to get approved as part of it.
And it became more expensive after the fees increase.
Very expensive during the fee increase period. And again, there's very little benefit unless you're going to be doing projects in each of those geographical areas. So I think
many projects.
Exactly. Kind of just, it's a lot of compliance, a lot of paperwork, a lot of headache. I don't think people are like just running to file those. Now on the 956F, we do see people running to file, right? Those regional centers that do exist are sponsoring a lot of projects. Demand is keeping steady. I think the numbers make a lot of sense. What's surprising to me is the denial rate. As an attorney myself, a 956F, they're really looking for three things: location of the project, qualifying in a TEA or not, the job creation methodology, not job creation itself, methodology, and the viability of the project. And viability of the project could be any number of, do you have the equity in place? Is the land already purchased? Are permits already approved? What is the likelihood that this project will move forward? To achieve, to not hit one of those three standards, it's a pretty, to me, tough thing to do. USCIS is pretty black and white in terms of what they will accept for each of those three things. TEA analysis is about as black and white as it's ever been, right? In the old days, it used to be tough. You had to conjoin, sometimes 20 or 30 different census tracts to get the numbers that you needed. Now it's like 5 or 6 max, right? So it's much more simplified. To me, it's a little bit surprising that there's, almost a quarter of these applications are still being denied. It really makes me wonder who's filing them. Is it people who are not even using an immigration attorney, or is it immigration attorneys who are trying to push the envelope a little bit and try to make a project that might not normally qualify, try to recoup some jobs in ways that are more creative to make it qualify? And that's ultimately why you see this high denial rate.
And this denial rate is actually concerning, especially for investors who choose to invest in the project without the project approval. So that's mean automatically that their petitions would be denied. And it really depends on the regional center you invested with, how long would it take to get your money back. And especially like for Indian investors, when this is like not only money, but also time, especially with the point that the backlog is going to happen soon at some point. No one knows when, but like everyone knows that soon. So they are probably in the most unfavorable position.
Exactly. I mean, I think Chinese and Indian investors both are kind of in tough positions because, the difference between 1 month in filing could be the difference between being able to file an adjustment or not. And there's a lot of Chinese investors who are in the US who are nowadays filing, students, et cetera. So the stakes are high. I would love to say that, looking at the track record of a regional center, even someone like ours, like we have a project right now that's not 956F approved. The first question I get is, well, I know that you guys have 30 plus approvals, but what happens if this one gets denied? And then to your point, it's not a good situation for anyone if one does get denied.
But it does happening, unfortunately, as we see, 1/5 of the projects
Correct.
is denied by USCIS. Okay, and here we try to look at the productivity of USCIS. It doesn't give us any like kind of obvious information, but looking at these numbers, we're trying to predict what's going to happen with processing times for investors. Are they going to get shorter, longer, and how busy are USCIS with the reviewing of the petitions? And we can see that the number of petitions reviewed in 2025 were more or less the same as in 2024, while the investors' petitions they had a bigger decline in the numbers by US CIS. So that may potentially lead to slightly longer processing times. What are your thoughts here?
Yeah, I think these numbers are pretty interesting. Again, they mirror a lot of what we've seen anecdotally in the industry. I don't think that's surprising necessarily, but it gives us a little bit of context, right? It does seem like between 2024 and 2025, USCIS was really just pumping out record adjudications, right? This is as much as we've seen them in terms of productivity. And I don't see them being much better, to be honest. I don't think that they can do any better than they've done in terms of adjudications. I think what's really great to see is the number of A29 applications, right? Clearly, they are basically starting to at least meet demand, even go a little bit above and beyond. Whereas we used to see, sometimes A29s would take 3 years to be adjudicated. Now we're hearing a lot better reports of 6 months to 1 year, which I think is a much more acceptable time frame to get your permanent green card. So it's nice to see USCIS adjudications keeping pace with 829s that are coming with them, at least new ones. They've still got a bunch that are obviously pending and they have a lot of catching up to do, but hey, we'll take what we can get. 526, 526E, this is where backlogs really start to make a huge problem, become a huge problem. They're not even keeping up with demand, and they're, what I think, again, adjudicating to the best of their abilities. To see them get through, like 7,000 applications on the 526, 526E, 526 legacy side, and still fall further behind, it's concerning. And it's only going to get worse, I think, as we approach grandfathering and reauthorization, because more and more people, all that demand is going to get pulled forward. More and more people are going to be filing. And so, unfortunately, I just think that, until a backlog hits, you're just going to see demand continue to outpace USCIS adjudication timelines. But yeah, I'll try to take the silver lining here and say, hey, we'll take what we can get. And it is nice to see that USCIS is at the very minimum doing their job.
But it's very, very, very far from promised 180 days. TA projects.
Very far from that. Very, very far from that. And there's still a lot of work to be done. I think the Reform and Integrity Act solved a lot of problems. It also created new ones. But to me, these are better problems to have. The next problem is probably the way that we see demand in the future and forecast it and how that appears on the visa bulletin, right? And that's a much more complicated problem than I think people realize. I don't think the Department of State is just, hoping for the best. I think they've got a real methodology, but this is the problem. You've got two different government agencies that are working together to achieve a result. And unfortunately, they're not, always on the same page. DHS, which is USCIS, Department of Homeland Security, they see a bunch of filings coming in, but they're not adjudicating them all at once. Department of State, which is who manages the visa bulletin, they only start changing the numbers on the visa bulletin when they see people coming into line waiting for a green card. And so they don't see that extra backlog at the USCIS level. Now, could USCIS communicate that with them? 100%. Would that solve the problem? Not necessarily, right? I think to your point about the 180 days, the idea here is to start having clear benchmarks of when you can expect approvals. And so if you've got X number of applications that have been pending for X many days or Y number of days, then you can make a much better forecast for how many green cards you're going to need over the 6 months following that. And then you can create the visa bulletin kind of date, priority dates and things like that. So lots of problems still that we need to solve. I think that, we've come a long way since, you and I started, worrying about investors' statuses and, how they're going to get through this process and in what time. But still a lot of work to be done.
For me, it's actually interesting to see what's happening with the governmental fees as well. So it's so much contradicting the
Yeah,
things which
can't
happen.
say that we've
So
got the most
they
transparent
increased
government
the
right now.
fees. The things started to get a bit better with processing times, and now they are back to the old fees. They're going to increase it, but not as much as they used to be. So that means they're going to be continue to be limited on staff, and that's clearly going to lead to
Right.
longer
And I
processing
think
time.
that's such a great point because I think that sometimes, individuals forget to look at the bigger picture, right? And, we've seen it with a few of the different lawsuits that have been lodged during the RIA and what they've tried to achieve. On one hand, they look like they're looking out for investors or regional centers' best interest. But on the other hand, they create a separate problem that
Yeah,
they may not have even
like this
intended.
one with governmental fees.
And I think the filing fee one is a huge one because I think if you ask, every investor that filed, they would happily pay the additional, $6,000 or $7,000 that they were paying to get a faster adjudication. And now we're seeing them going back, regressing basically to, maybe even 9 to 12 months for rural and, over 2 years for HUA and infrastructure. It's not what anyone wanted. So here we
Yeah,
are.
I think everyone would be ready to pay extra 10 or 20,000 to get their petition approved in a few months' time. But
Yep,
yeah, that's
exactly. I
not
mean, we
what
get
we
investors
see.
who ask about premium processing all the time. So clearly they're willing to spend an extra few thousand to get a faster result. And although, the law firms that filed for that change, they hailed it as a big victory because they saved investors a lot of money. Really who they saved the money for is regional centers. Those fees got knocked
Yeah.
down by like $35,000. That's a huge win for regional centers. But like I said, I think 100% of investors that we talked to were okay with the filing fees if it meant that they were going to get processed in a timely manner. So here we are.
Okay, so what are the main driving factors for 2026? Why do we think that the number of petitions in 2026 still going to be continued to rise up?
Yeah, I think we're in one of those big watershed years where there's going to be a bunch of different things going on. And a lot of that uncertainty creates demand in EB-5. For all of its faults, it still is one of the best ways to achieve a green card in the United States. Again, if you've got the funds. The two, I think, or the three big milestones that everyone's keeping an eye on. The one that's coming up, faster than I think anyone's ready for is the grandfathering provision expiration. What is a grandfathering provision? In the Reform and Integrity Act, we solved one of the biggest problems that we've had, which was that if the program goes away, people who had already filed had no protection. Well, the grandfathering provision protects them. It basically says that as long as you file by September 30th, 2026, even if a year down the road this program just completely goes away and has a lapse, it doesn't mean that your application will then just be languishing at USCIS. It means that you will still be adjudicated. So this is a big protection because there's no guarantee that if you file after this protection, that you are protected. So this is the first big deadline. Definitely, we're seeing increased demand, and a lot of investors are treating this as a hard deadline. I think that's the correct move until we
Yeah.
know anything further. And you and I have been around long enough in EB-5 to know that things rarely happen before the due date, almost always after. So it's very possible that we'll see a lapse, maybe for even just a month or so after September, before maybe an extension to the grandfathering clause or something like that is approved. Kind of a hidden language that a lot of people didn't realize is that in January 2027, there's an automatic increase in the investment amount that's supposed to happen. It is supposed to be adjusted for inflation. I've seen a lot of numbers thrown out there. I don't honestly know, what the new amount might be. My guess would be somewhere in the 875 to 900K range for the TEAs, maybe in the 1.1, 1.2 range for the non-TEAs, but we'll see. I think that that's for Congress to decide, and all we can really do is administer the new amounts. But for sure, we know the increase is supposed to happen purportedly in January. Whether it happens in January, maybe a little bit later, maybe a little bit earlier, I think we'll just have to wait and see.
Yeah.
And then the real big one, I think, is
The
the
big one.
program. The big one is the reauthorization itself. Currently, the program is set to expire in September 30th of 2027. It's just too early right now. We haven't really heard too much There's a lot of support for EB-5. I think that a lot of the lobbying efforts have been met with a lot of enthusiasm to get the program reauthorized. So everything looks like it's pointing in the right way. Um, but like I said, until we get closer to the date, until we really start to feel that pressure, I don't think anyone's going to know for sure that this program will be extended. And when it is extended, will it be a 5-year extension? Will it be a 1-year extension? Will it be a 6-month extension? Will it be a forever extension? I think that's the big question. And I know that a lot of the lobbying efforts that the industry is doing right now is centered around making this more of a long-term reauthorization with individual kind of changes that can be administered every few years or whatnot, just so people don't have this stress that, oh, this program is just going to go away. So lots of drama over the next 18 months.
Yeah. I guess, like, at least from what I hear, the question is not if the program would be reauthorized or not. Like, majority
Right.
do agree that the program will be reauthorized. The question is
Right.
if it's going to happen smoothly, and would we have a lapse or not, as we had in 2021, and for how long it would be reauthorized. That's the questions in there.
Exactly.
Yeah.
And then, I guess aside from all these uncertainties that always create a little bit of demand, there's other uncertainties as well. The immigration environment in the United States right now, everyone's on edge. I mean, we've seen a big increase in Latin American visa holders, whether they are TNs, L1s, H1Bs, E2s. A lot of folks now are like, previously they were happy to just keep their current status until they decided to, ultimately move back to their home country or, figure out what their future plans are. Now they're very much saying like, hey, the E2 just isn't good enough anymore. I want to do an EB-5. I want to get my green card. I want to know that, I'm not going to get picked up in the street or something like that, as crazy as that sounds. So there's a lot obviously going on right now in the political space, the political theater of the United States, and it's leading to a lot of people turning to EB-5 as the most safe and viable option to receive permanent residency. And the biggest driver of all these things is that the visa bulletin is still current. So for those investors, especially who are in the US, seeing that they have an opportunity to file an adjustment of status concurrently and get themselves, a work permit and a travel permit, even if they do enter into a backlog in the future, it's a big plus, right? It's like, hey, I don't know what's going to happen over the next 5-6 years. For Indian applicants, a 5-6 year green card is still much better than a 50-year green card, which is what they're typically in. And even for, let's say, a Chinese student who is looking at a 10-year kind of timeline to go through the normal H1B, EB2, EB3 process before they get a green card, if they can get a green card over the next 5-6 years, although that might be a little bit fortuitous at this point, it's still a good option. And getting that work permit and travel permit while you're in the US is a huge part of that. So yeah, lots of drivers for demand right now.
Yeah, I guess it's going to be super busy till September 2026. And after that, there is going to be some slowdown for some period of time, but we'll see how it's going to go.
Yep. Yeah. And, unfortunately, I keep saying that we've been around for a long time, but we have been around long enough to know that, there were years like 2020 and 2021 where basically no one was doing an EB-5 application, and then we turn around in 22 onwards, and it was like the biggest kind of rush that we've seen since 2012, 2010, those kinds of days. So everything happens in cycles. EB-5 is no different. I'm a firm believer in the program and what it stands for, and kind of the way it's a win. If you do it right, everyone wins. The investors win, the developers win, the regional centers win, America wins. So, it's really about finding a way to get this program really refined and serve everyone's best interest and not just kind of the powers that be. And I think we've made a lot of steps over the RIA to get there. And I'm excited, honestly, to see what happens over the next few years as we continue to move forward.
And on this positive note, Ahmed, thanks a lot for your insight and information you shared. As always, it was a real pleasure to have this recording with you.
Yeah, my pleasure. Pleasure's always mine. Thanks so much, Ramar, for having me. Always great to talk shop with you, and I look forward to doing it again soon.
Thank you. And for those who are listening, if you have any questions, don't hesitate and just reach out. We will set up the consultation where we can answer all the questions you may have in regards of the EB-5 program or the projects currently open for EB-5 investment. Thank you. Bye.
Thanks, everyone.